So I believe we're going to start with Mr. Rod Hall.
Two comments. First of all, there's a close tie between Northern California and Bataan. California National Guard from Salinas, the 194th Tank Battalion, was sent out to the Philippines in late 1941 and fought valiantly in Bataan. So there is a direct connection with Northern California. The second one is that Sasha mentioned PTSD and nobody knowing anything over here. Well, I think part of that, Sasha, was that we just didn't talk about it. I went through school and jobs and all kinds of things and never mentioned a word about my experiences. It took me 50 years when we had the 1995 celebration that I opened up and started talking to people, and now I don't stop talking about it. But it took 50 years, so was it PTSD or whatever it was, we kept our stories to ourselves. It just wanted to fit in with everybody else. Our story was just too different. I was in the 4th grade when the war began, Pearl Harbor, and the day the war started, my mother came and picked us up out of school, car loaded with canned goods because Dad said go and buy what you can, and took us home. He was picked up a couple of days later and went to San Tomas. The Japanese considered everybody born in the Philippines to be Filipinos. So we stayed at home. We moved in with my grandmother. Our Chinese ama, fearing what had happened in Nanking, wore not her black pajamas and the Chinese dress. She wore dressed like all Filipinos, afraid of it, until they eventually started back to the trousers. During the year, I went to St. Paul's Convent, a girls' school run by French nuns that let boys into the 6th grade. We went there daily. It was about a 3-block walk from the house. One day, I'm not sure if it was 1942 or when Japan, or 43, when Japan signed the peace treaty with the Philippines, we were asked, the school was asked to send a contingent, and I volunteered to go. So we were given little Japanese flags and told at certain times to shout Banzai on the Luneta, on the big boulevard. I got hell when I got home, having agreed to go. After the 6th grade, we were tutored at home by a professor, Jewish professor that the Jesuits had given a home to. And it was the most interesting, fun schooling that I've had in my life. When we killed a pig that we raised, that day it was a biology lesson, and we watched the pig being slaughtered. And we felt the lungs and the stomach and everything else. Once a week we went to catechism, Irish priest at Malate Church, Father Monahan, who sat at the head of the table and smoked long black cigars while he taught us our catechism. Our entire garden was turned into a vegetable garden. We had over 40 chickens, and the chickens were trapped when they laid an egg, and if they didn't lay enough eggs, we ate them. Dad got quite a few passes the first years, so he'd get a weekend pass or a 1-week pass from San Tomas and come home and stay with us. He had to wear an armband, which has its disadvantages because the Japanese could see you were a prisoner. The advantage was that none of the calesas and the horse-drawn carts charged him any ticket prices because they knew he was from San Tomas. At the corner from our house, half a block away, at the corner of Dakota and Heran, as the streets were called then, was a comfort house for Japanese officers. My friends and brother and I would go into the bushes. They used the porches as makeup rooms, and we would watch these ladies get all dressed up and put the kimonos on in the evening, waiting for the officers to arrive. there was no work. None of the men, all the men stayed at home. They had no work to do during the war. So they sat around and organized poker games or talked. Our home was very crowded because as the Japanese started taking over, they would come in, throw people out of their house, and we ended up having several people living in our homes who had lost their homes by requisitioning. There were no cars, horse-drawn carts, or you walked. The banks had closed. The Japanese could have let a lot of people out to live in Manila in the early days. But if you were an executive with an American company, the war came, your salary check stopped. You had savings in the bank, Citibank, Bank of America, they were closed. You had no way to live. In February of this year, I went to the little exhibition at Santo Tomas University for the 70th anniversary. And I was very moved by the number of letters that were posted that had been written to the Japanese commandant of Santo Tomas internment camp from Americans and British begging to be allowed to come into camp. Now, nobody talks about that. They say, my wife is a Filipina, but my son and I, we like to have permission to come. They had no way to live on the outside, although everybody was very helpful to those that had nothing. Those letters really struck me. My mother wrote a letter to my father in Santo Tomas. The diamond brooch you bought me in Paris, I've just traded for a 2-kilo can of dried milk. Klim was the guy. That's what she was prepared to do to get milk for the children, although it was dried milk. As the war went on, my grandmother in Edinburgh, Scotland, wrote a letter to my father, Mr. A.C. Hall, British prisoner, civilian prisoner of war, Santo Tomas was the address, saying that Henry has heard from Joe, who expects to spend his next birthday with the family. Well, Henry was my Uncle Henry, who was an intelligence officer with the U.S. Air Force in England. And Uncle Joe had escaped Corregidor with MacArthur, and when he said he expected to spend his next holiday with his family, they hurried around, and some woman in Santo Tomas remembered his birthday was the 23rd of March, which was about a month after the liberation. The air raid started the 21st of September. I remember 10 Japanese trucks all burned out. There was a carrier plane that was coming down, and they dropped their fuel tanks exactly on Padre Faura, which is covered with trees, where the Japanese had parked to shelter their trucks that were all burned. As the air raids continued, there were more and more troops. They started putting up roadblocks. You had to bow from the waist and tell them in our fractured Japanese that we lived there or why we had to pass. At St. Paul's, we had to take Japanese lessons. I learned the katakana, which helped me when I was a GI visiting Japan to read the signs in the underground. We all cheated because the nuns were one lesson ahead of us, and they didn't mind if we whispered the answers to each other. For us, the war hit about 2 weeks before the Americans entered Manila. 20th of January, we were sitting in our porch, pounding in the garden gate, and about 25 soldiers came in and formed a skirmish line with bayonets and advanced to the house. Just about the time they arrived at the house, we heard shouting in the back, and all the servants came through with another bunch of soldiers pushing. They kept us there all day, searched the house completely, found a shortwave radio that my uncle used to listen to. My uncle had been in the Death March, escaped and was come home close to death with malaria, survived and got involved in guerrilla activities, among them listening to the news. They tied the men's arms behind their back, marched us the 6 or 7 blocks to the Masonic Temple, which was the Marines headquarters, and kept us there all day. At the end of the afternoon, they called out a list of names, and all the adults went over there, and after my grandmother's name, they called my name, and they said, no, you go here. My brother and I and the servants were put in another group. 2 other groups had been rounded up that day, and the same thing happened there. They marched us to the door and threw us out. And I never saw the rest of my family again, and the 2 people that were living with us, my mother, grandmother, uncle, and aunt. We were allowed to send them food for about 5 or 6 days, and one day they said, no more food. The day after we were arrested, some bandits came in the middle of the night and took everything of value that hadn't been hidden. A truck came at 6 in the morning and they disappeared. So a friend of my mother's, married to a German, he complained to the Japanese army, and for about a week we had a Japanese sentry every night patrolling in front of our house. So the Japanese army was guarding us while the Japanese Marines had our family. The things really got bad. Shelling was constant every day. The fires started, you couldn't walk outside, it was too dangerous. The fires started, we had a large garden. The only reason our house didn't catch fire, we could see 300 yards or more in every direction. They rounded up, the Japanese rounded up all the people and took them to St. Paul's Convent, put them into the rooms, threw in grenades, and killed a lot, but the grenades opened the wall and allowed many to escape. We had about 150 people run to our house over the wall, and we all lived underneath the house. Nobody thinks about this, and I've spoken to younger children, but what do you do in a situation like this? No electricity, you can't keep the food fresh in the refrigerator. No telephones, no water. We dug a well in the garden, and the men dug it deeper because there were more of us. We boiled the water. We cooked with charcoal, we cooked with wood. But think about living without utilities for a while. Nobody thinks about that. Suddenly one day, the men in our house looked up, and there was a fellow that they said, what are you doing here? You live in North Manila. He said, yes, I've come with the soldiers. They're half a block away. So we went to talk to them, and the soldiers said, you know, we're pulling back tonight. What do you think we should do? Well, we think you should come with us. So they arranged for it, and most of the people in the house packed up their belongings, and we walked through the middle of the blocks, through the parts of the destroyed and burned houses. We had to wait until a GI got a tank destroyer because there was a machine gun covering an intersection, and we spent the night out in the open. The next morning, there was warm food. The U.S. Army had come with a jeep with these huge cauldrons of scrambled eggs and coffee and stuff, and we had a great breakfast. We were starting to make a home in the ashes, and I saw a relative walk by, and I said, look at what we're doing over here. We're building a house. And he said, oh my God, your father's desperate. So he took us, and we had to circle Manila entirely because all the fighting was in the middle to get to San Tomas, and they called for my father, and he arranged for us to come in there. And we stayed there until things normalized and went back to the house. I left Manila in the 2nd or 3rd of May, 1945, on the USS General Harry S. Taylor. And I mentioned that because 10 years later, in 1955, I was a GI, light weapons infantry, on my way to Korea to spend a year and a half. So that's my story.